The chandeliers of the Waldorf Astoria burned like captured stars above Chicago's elite. Laughter sparkled in the air, a symphony of crystal glasses and whispered ambition. Beneath the gleam of golden glass, Dr. Naomi Carter stood still. So still she could almost hear her heartbeat breaking. Across the ballroom, her husband, Elliot Harrington, co-founder of their celebrated firm, Harrington and Carter Global Strategies, was smiling. That practiced, effortless smile that had charmed politicians, investors, and journalists alike. Tonight, though, his hand rested on another woman's waist. She was young, pale, and perfect in the sort of way magazines like to photograph. Her name was Clara Voss, a consultant Naomi had never met, never approved, never even heard mentioned in staff meetings. Yet here she was, draped in silver satin, introduced to the entire crowd as the newest addition to the Harrington and Carter family, our rising star. Naomi's breath caught, the sound of applause crashing around her like waves breaking against rock. He hadn't just betrayed her, he had erased her. Her eyes drifted upward to the banner arching over the grand stage, Harrington and Carter Annual Vision Gala. It was her idea, her event, her dream of showcasing ethical innovation in global economics. She had planned it for months while Elliot claimed he was too busy managing investors. Now she understood why. He had managed everything, except shame. As champagne flutes clinked and cameras flashed, Naomi watched him lean close to whisper something in Clara's ear. The young woman laughed, tilting her head with the easy confidence of someone who belonged. Elliot's wedding ring, Naomi realized, was gone. Her stomach hollowed into silence. The crowd shifted like a single organism, its curiosity electric. Whispers brushed her shoulders like moth wings. Isn't that his new partner? She's been around for a while. Poor Naomi. I heard she stepped back to focus on research. Research. The word sliced her open. Naomi's world had always been numbers, logic, precision, but this was chaos. Her name, once spoken with respect in boardrooms and symposiums, was now a rumor trailing through crystal halls. She forced a steady breath, smoothing the emerald satin of her gown, as if the act alone could iron the humiliation from her skin. A waiter passed by with champagne. Naomi took a flute, not to drink but to anchor her trembling hand. She told herself to smile. Grace was armor now, dignity, her last currency. The speech began. Elliot's voice filled the ballroom, smooth, deliberate, commanding. Tonight we celebrate innovation, partnership, and vision. His arm tightened around Clara's waist. Naomi felt her pulse echo the word partnership. The irony was exquisite. He spoke of the firm's future, of a new phase of leadership, and fresh perspectives. No mention of Naomi Carter, the woman who had written the very business model he now flaunted as his own. No acknowledgement of the scholar whose doctoral thesis had inspired the firm's global sustainability initiative. Only we, as though she were a ghost haunting the syntax of his success. Applause thundered again. Elliot's smile gleamed like frost under the chandeliers. Naomi set her untouched drink on a passing tray and turned away from the stage. Her heels clicked softly across the marble, each step a controlled act of defiance. She felt eyes following her, pity, fascination, gossip disguised as sympathy. The air was too thick to breathe. She slipped through the side doors into the quieter corridor, where the music thinned and the scent of lilies replaced the cloying sweetness of champagne. For a moment, she pressed her hand against the wall, grounding herself. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the gilt mirror opposite. Dark skin radiant against emerald silk, hair sculpted in elegant coils, eyes bright with unshed fury. She looked powerful, untouchable, and yet inside, she felt stripped bare. She thought of the years spent building everything beside him, long nights drafting proposals, the first cramped office overlooking the river, the exhilaration of their early triumphs. She thought of how she had believed in partnership, in love that grew through shared purpose. Now the man she had built an empire with was standing beneath the lights, pretending she no longer existed. Outside, snow was beginning to fall. Through the tall windows, she could see the flakes catching in the glow of street lamps. Fragile, endless, silent. She reached for her phone. Dozens of unread messages blinked across the screen. Reporters, colleagues, old friends. She turned it face down. Her world had just burned down in public view, but deep in the ashes, something fierce began to stir. She lifted her chin, gathered what remained of her pride, and walked toward the elevator. Every step away from the ballroom felt like reclaiming oxygen. Every breath, a promise whispered to herself. You will rise from this. And as the elevator doors closed, sealing her away from the echo of applause, Naomi Carter exhaled the last remnants of the woman who had once believed that partnership meant equality. This was the moment her story began again, not as someone's wife, but as the architect of her own resurrection. If this moment moved you, if you felt Naomi's quiet fire beneath the glittering ruin, pause for a heartbeat before you go. Tap like, leave your thoughts in the comments, and follow for the next chapter of her rise. Because sometimes the most beautiful stories begin exactly where everything else falls apart. Washington moved like a river of decision. Marble steps and briefcases, vows and budgets, everything sweeping toward some shining future none of them could quite touch. On the morning Naomi Carter first met Elliot Harrington, the air over the Potomac smelled of rain, and the city felt newly washed, as if possibility had been pressed and laid out to dry on the Capitol steps. She had come to the Treasury Annex with a leather folio tucked under her arm and the quiet poise of someone raised to make room for truth, even when truth had to shoulder its way through a crowded room. Her paper, on equitable growth models for distressed urban corridors, had already stirred more conversation than she expected. Staffers in navy suits angled for her hand, murmuring, "Impressive work," the way people murmur grace before a meal. Naomi thanked them, then slipped to the side, where the windows showed the water running flat and silver beneath a gathering sky. He appeared at her shoulder as if called by weather. "Your thesis," he said without introduction, "treats people like more than variables. That's rare around here." She turned. Tall, clean lines, a tie the color of late plums, eyes that seemed somehow both shy and sure of themselves. "And you are?" He offered his card, the name stamped in crisp ink, Elliot Harrington. Harrington Foundation Fellow, Harvard Kennedy Initiative. Old Chicago money, Naomi thought, reading between the lines. An inheritance braided into opportunity. "I'm not a fan of rare," he added, "unless it's a thing worth protecting." "I prefer replicable," she said, unable to help the smile. They were introduced on the record an hour later by a deputy assistant secretary who pretended he was just then placing them in the same orbit, but by then it felt inevitable. Elliot asked thoughtful questions, the kind that suggested he'd read not only the paper, but the footnotes and the lives they hinted at. He praised the elegance of her data, but lingered over the ethics, the stubborn insistence that policy should feel like help when it arrived on a doorstep. He listened as if listening were an art. When the session broke, he asked if she had time for coffee. She told him she had 3 other meetings. Somehow, the coffee appeared between the second and the third, the two of them standing at a high window in a corridor that smelled faintly of paper and rain. He asked about Atlanta. She asked about Lake Michigan winters and whether they taught patience or pride. He spoke of his mother's philanthropy, his father's boardrooms, the weight of a last name that opened doors and let the draft in. She spoke of church basements and public libraries, of a geometry teacher who'd said the world belongs to anyone who can solve for X and still show their work. Work found them quickly. The Harvard Kennedy Initiative wanted to pilot a public-private framework. Treasury wanted plausible magic with numbers that survived daylight. Elliot suggested a joint project. Naomi almost said no, her days already a constellation of deadlines, then found herself saying yes the way one says yes to a song that feels like wind through open windows. They met at an old townhouse near DuPont Circle that the initiative had filled with policy dreams and mid-century chairs. He spread proposals across a long oak table, and she arranged models like paper constellations until meaning gathered under her hands. Arguments became flirtations, and flirtations became drafts, the kind with margins full of exclamation marks and the occasional penciled heart he pretended not to notice. On Thursdays, they walked the mall at dusk. The monuments lifted their pale faces to a darkening sky, and tour groups receded like tide. Naomi learned the cadence of his silence, the places he paused, the way he looked at buildings as if he were translating their columns into sentences. Elliot learned her laugh and the way she guarded her joy, as if joy were a lit candle in a room with too many open doors. One evening, a storm scattered the city into glistening shards. They ducked into a narrow bar off H Street, where candles trembled in little glasses, and the bartender sliced limes with reverence. Elliot's shirt clung damp to his shoulders. Naomi's curls sprang free at her temples, beautiful and rebellious. A trio in the corner played something tender on a stand-up bass. He told her he admired how she refused to make herself smaller for any room. She told him he carried his privilege like a responsibility instead of a trophy. They sat with that sentence between them. Then he reached for her hand. She let him. He kissed her later in the soft shelter of a doorway, rain tapping the awning like cautious applause. It was a kiss that felt less like possession and more like permission. To be seen, to be called by name, to be wanted without asterisks. Naomi understood, even as the sweetness of it spread through her, that permission could be revoked by the world or by fear. But for a moment, the world was just rain and an alley strung with fairy lights. His family required a different weather. When she flew to Chicago for a foundation gala, the Harrington townhouse received her with curated hospitality. Paintings that did not raise their voices, rugs that held secrets. Elliot's mother admired Naomi's scholarship with a smile that froze not at the edges, but somewhere underneath. "So admirable," she said, "the work you do for communities." His father asked brisk questions about scalability and political palatability, then drifted toward a senator who could be relied upon to stay within the lines. Later in the car, Elliot gripped the steering wheel and said, softly, "I'm sorry." Naomi touched his sleeve. "For what you didn't do?" He didn't answer. Back in Washington, the project blossomed, then bloomed beyond its trellis. The pilot numbers sang. A secretary praised their model in a briefing. An editor asked for an op-ed. Naomi, who believed in the work more than the weather around it, saw a future made of scaffolding and sunlight. Elliot saw a firm before either of them said the word. "Harrington and Carter," he suggested one night, scrawling the names on a napkin in a cafe that served pie as if it remembered your birthdays. "Alphabetical is brutal," she teased, though a spark leapt inside her chest. "Carter and Harrington?" He grinned. "We could alternate annually." She shook her head, laughing. "Let the world learn both." They signed articles of incorporation at a cheap wooden desk she'd inherited from a grad school apartment. He bought lilies. She brewed coffee that tasted like resolve. Their first office had thin carpet and a stubborn radiator. Their first client had a problem no one else knew how to love. They worked until the streetlights yawned. Sometimes their elbows touched across the desk and they didn't pull away. There were hints, small as splinters. A donor who praised Naomi's articulate briefing as if surprised by her voice. An advisor who suggested smoothing her hair for the annual photo. Elliot winced at those moments, sliced the air with careful, correct words. But sometimes he changed the subject. Sometimes he said, "Pick your battles," with a tired smile that looked borrowed from somebody's father. She filed the splinters away. Everybody bleeds a little for a dream, she told herself. And yet, there were days when the dreams set the room aglow. They drafted a code of ethics, framed it, hung it crooked, and laughed while they straightened it together. They argued about fonts and the future of capitalism. They became the kind of partners who knew how to carry weight for each other without making it a ledger. The night they won their first major grant, the city was a bouquet of lights. Elliot lifted her hand to his lips, reverent. "We did this," he whispered. Naomi looked out at the river, pleased by the plural, but a little afraid of it too. She thought of Atlanta, of church pews and her mother's voice. "Keep your name, baby. Keep your name even when you share your life." She kept it. She kept her spine and her smile and her habit of telling truth in rooms that preferred music. And when Elliot said, under a canopy of new stars, "Let's build something that outlives us," she said yes with her whole astonished heart. unaware of how long a shadow ambition can cast when the light is mismatched, unaware of how easily a promise becomes a stage if no one watches the trapdoor. They walked home through a city that believed in mornings. She pressed the napkin with their names into her notebook and thought, simply, begin. The office began as a rumor of an office. 2 rooms over a bakery in River North, windows fogged by winter, and the sweet insistence of cinnamon below. The carpet sighed when they crossed it. The radiators knocked like polite ghosts. They taped their name, Harrington and Carter Global Strategies, to the glass with the gravity of a christening. Naomi brought a spider plant and a stack of journals. Elliot arrived with lilies, a printer that refused all driver updates, and a bottle of sparkling wine that opened like a promise. They learned the choreography of beginning. Mornings smelled of coffee and wet coats. Naomi drew frameworks on the whiteboard in clean, convincing loops, equations braided to outcomes until the abstract grew limbs. Elliot paced as he rehearsed the overture that would usher a wary world into their music. A paragraph burnished for donors, a sentence tuned for ministers, a line softened for mayors who did not trust dreamers. At noon, the bakery sent up croissants warm enough to feel like mercy. Their first client arrived wrapped in fatigue, a Midwestern city with a hollow downtown and a tax base that had learned to stop believing. Naomi listened, mapping grief to policy like a patient cartographer. She built a model that treated people not as percentages, but as pulse, micro-lending that breathed, transit that stitched neighborhoods rather than severing them, incentives that insisted on dignity as a line item. Elliot toured the city's echoing factories with the mayor, touched brick, asked names, made late calls to donors with the soft persistence of tide. When the plan passed council by a single trembling vote, Naomi exhaled into her scarf on the walk home and felt the air take her into confidence. From there, the world widened. A coalition of historically black colleges and universities invited Naomi to keynote. A Scandinavian foundation asked for a white paper on resilient infrastructure. Their website, still wearing its first suit of fonts, caught the light of a journalist hungry for a story about competence paired with conscience. Photos followed. Naomi at a whiteboard, sleeves rolled, eyes lifted toward a solution only she could see. Elliot against a skyline, tie like a declaration. They framed the article and hung it slightly crooked above the plant, then laughed and fixed it together. They hired carefully. Marisol, who could read a municipal budget as if it were a lover's letter and spot the lie tenderly. Tomas, a PhD who coded like a poet. Grace, whose gift was listening in ways that made strangers tell the truth. Naomi drafted the firm's code of ethics and printed it on thick paper that felt almost ceremonial. "We do not trade dignity for access," it read. "We do not substitute optics for outcomes. We do not confuse charity with justice." They signed at the bottom in ink that smudged slightly, as if the vow wanted to live on their skin. Nights stretched long, but the labor glowed. They ordered Thai at 10, noodles coiled in cartons like bright intentions. Sometimes Naomi fell asleep over a data set and woke to a blanket tucked around her shoulders, Elliot's coat on the chair, a post-it at her elbow. "You are the engine and the light." Sometimes he returned from a dinner where men with marble hallways spoke in numbers that pretended to be neutral. He sat on the office floor and asked to hear again how a transit line can alter a life expectancy map. She told him, and in her telling, the room felt newly inhabited by possibility. Success arrived first as a hush, funders listening closer, officials returning calls faster, then as noise, panels, profiles, invitations edged with embossed crests. They moved to a larger space by the river, where glass and steel held the morning like a breath. Naomi stood at those windows and traced routes across the city with her fingertip. Food deserts turning green, buses arriving like kept promises. A ledger in which the arithmetic finally learned to love the people inside it. And yet, even as the dream gathered muscle, splinters persisted. At a photo shoot for a magazine spread, a stylist smiled at Naomi's curls and suggested sleekness for the cover. Naomi held the woman's gaze until the suggestion crumpled by itself. Later, Elliot murmured, weary, "Optics, just this once." then saw the storm touch her eyes and pulled the words back into his mouth. "You're right," he said softly. "You're right." He kissed her temple as though that could sand the world smooth. At a gala in New York, a donor congratulated Elliot on building such a talented team. And Elliot, tired, tuxedoed, delighted by the praise, let the sentence land without corrections. Naomi smiled through it, the way one smiles through a sudden ache. On the flight home, Elliot pressed his forehead to the window and said, "I should have said your name." She shrugged as if it were nothing, and watched their plane carve a clean path through clouds that looked like a geography of forgetting. Work continued to sing. A southern county piloted their school lunch procurement reforms and found local farmers at the back door by spring. A coastal city used Naomi's storm resilience model to rewrite its building codes, saving money and futures with the same pen stroke. Elliot returned from Oslo with a card from Lars Brenner, a man whose fun could move entire summers into new latitudes. "Careful," Naomi warned, half joking. "Some tides take whatever they touch." Elliot smiled, pocketing the card as if to keep its weather contained. In the second year, they took a rare weekend. Door County, maple leaves scandalous in their honesty. They rented a cottage with a porch that faced the water and cooked eggs in a pan that had outlived several loves. In that slow light, they looked like a version of themselves, unafraid of the word always. Elliot traced plans on her palm: expansion to Atlanta, a fellowship for first-generation policy students, a pro bono unit. Naomi listened with her eyes closed, letting the cadence rearrange her heartbeats. She said yes to all of it, and to the man beside her, who seemed, in that hour, to be building a life as carefully as any model she'd written. They returned to Chicago with cheeks kissed by cold and a new staff folder labeled Future. The team grew. The plant at reception made a valiant attempt at thriving. Naomi began a Thursday ritual, afternoon seminars where junior analysts walked the room through what they did not yet know and were applauded for the elegance of their uncertainty. Elliot instituted Mondays without meetings, a kindness masquerading as policy. They were not perfect, but they were good. And goodness, when braided to talent and opportunity, becomes a current. Cities called, foundations courted. The firm's logo showed up in places that once asked skeptically why two ambitious people believed they could bend policy toward tenderness. Naomi learned to sleep on planes. Elliot learned to take no for an answer without making it a grudge. On a night when snow came soft as forgiveness and the river laced itself with silver, Naomi stood alone in the conference room and looked at the projection wall where their year unfurled in charts. Outcomes improved, dollars accounted for, bright bars rising like a hymn. She felt pride, unadorned and ferocious. Behind the pride, something else flickered, an intuition with no name yet. A warning the mind cannot quite parse when the heart is loud with praise. Elliot found her there, arms folded, gaze traveling the horizon of their making. He touched the small of her back. "We did it," he whispered, and for a moment the words were true in every key. She leaned into his palm, let herself be held by the plural. Outside, Chicago turned its necklaces of light against the black throat of winter. Inside, the dream breathed like a living thing, warm against the glass. They locked the office and stepped into the night, unaware of how ambition can grow antlers in the dark, how love can be mapped until the map becomes a territory with borders that demand a passport one of you cannot produce. For now they were only two people who had built something improbable with their hands and their hours, walking home beneath a sky that promised more of everything. More rooms to enter, more names to learn, more mornings in which the work might keep being worthy of their belief. The glass tower of Harrington and Carter gleamed against the morning sun, proud and perfect, its reflections rippling across the Chicago River like a promise that could never break. Inside, the hum of success had become a constant, the kind of sound people stopped hearing once they began to believe they had earned it. Naomi Carter, in her quiet office overlooking the skyline, still noticed every note of it. The low murmur of analysts comparing forecasts, the distant laughter from the executive lounge, the way Elliot's voice traveled down the hall, smooth as lacquer, practiced as applause. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, there was something else, something hollow and humming just beneath the surface, like the faint tremor before glass fractures. She couldn't remember the first time Elliot began introducing her simply as our lead strategist instead of my co-founder. Perhaps it was at the Aspen Summit, where cameras clicked and champagne glittered, and someone had said, "You two make quite the team." And Elliot had smiled and replied, "Yes, I'm lucky to have such a brilliant strategist. Not partner, not wife, just brilliant, just strategic, just convenient." At first, Naomi told herself it didn't matter. She didn't need labels. Her work spoke for itself. Until one day it didn't. In a client meeting with the Brenner Fund, Elliot had redirected a question meant for her. She remembered the slow sting of his interruption, the soft pressure of his hand over hers under the table, as if to say, "Trust me, let me lead this one." Afterward, he said, "You know how old school Lars is. Let me read the room next time." Naomi had smiled thinly. "I read it just fine." That night, while Elliot fielded congratulatory calls from investors, she stared out at the city's reflection in the river. How skyscrapers bent and blurred in the water. Beautiful, but untrue. The change was gradual, the way erosion always is. A word softened here, a decision deferred there. She noticed her name appearing lower on the slides, smaller on the reports. Invitations arrived addressed to Mr. Elliot Harrington and guest. When she raised it, Elliot laughed. "You think too much about the details." "The details are the only honest part," she replied. He kissed her temple. "You're overanalyzing again. That's what I love about you, but sometimes, just breathe." He said it so gently that she almost forgot it was condescension. The next gala arrived, a smaller one, for donors. Naomi wore navy silk and the confidence she'd built over years of being extraordinary. But the evening dissolved into a tableau she could hardly name. She overheard a woman say, "She's impressive, but a little intense, don't you think?" Another voice replied, "Yes, well, Elliot balances that beautifully." And there he was, balancing. Always balancing her out. Later, he leaned in and whispered, "Maybe smile more tonight. Some people read your focus as cold." "Cold?" she said softly. "Would you like me to giggle through the GDP projections next time?" He sighed, the way men sigh when they think they are being patient. "Naomi, this isn't about you and me. It's about optics." Optics. The word struck her like glass underfoot. She smiled then, too sweetly, and said, "And what do you think I look like to them, Elliot?" He hesitated, and in that silence was the beginning of her undoing. Their home began to reflect the distance that their office tried to hide. The framed awards and photographs, press clippings, magazine covers, showed two people frozen in perfect harmony. But the real Naomi and Elliot moved through the penthouse like actors in a play that no longer knew its lines. She worked later, often sleeping on the office couch, surrounded by the scent of stale coffee and Triumph gone cold. He started attending more working dinners. When he came home, he spoke in abstractions: networking, opportunities, positioning. One night, he returned from an investor's retreat in Aspen. Naomi was reviewing a report by lamplight, glasses low on her nose. He poured a drink and said, "You know, some of the partners suggested you should focus more on thought leadership, writing, speaking, that sort of thing. Let the client relations side evolve." "Evolve?" she echoed. He swirled his whiskey, avoiding her eyes. "You've done the hard work. Maybe it's time to step back a little, focus on the big picture." The big picture. A polite way to erase the person who had drawn it. Naomi closed the folder. "You mean make room for you?" He met her gaze. "That's not fair." But the tone, soft, defensive, told her it was true. The next morning, she arrived early. The city was still shaking off its dawn. She stood before the glass wall of the conference room, the one that reflected everything: sky, river, herself. Her reflection stared back, composed, unflinching, but with a faint crack along the edges of her certainty. She touched the glass, fingertips cold. A young analyst entered, startled. "Dr. Carter, I didn't see you there." Naomi smiled. "That's all right," she said. "Sometimes people forget I'm still here." It was half joke, half truth. But when she saw the confusion in the analyst's eyes, she felt how close those halves were to becoming indistinguishable. That night, she found an old notebook from their early days, handwritten notes, ideas scrawled in the margins beside Elliot's sketches. We'll build something that matters, he had written once. Something that lasts. She traced the ink, faded now but not gone. How strange, she thought, that things could fade without disappearing. That love could be erased not by hatred, but by the slow, silent polish of ambition. The mirror had not shattered yet, but the crack was spreading. And somewhere deep within her, beneath the practiced poise and the relentless reason, Naomi began to understand what every economist eventually learns, that nothing, no system, no empire, no love, is immune to collapse once its foundation begins to lie. Snow came to Chicago with northern manners that winter, polite, precise, unwilling to make a scene. On Naomi's calendar, a name appeared with similar restraint. Lars Brenner, Oslo-born sovereign fund architect, the kind of man who moved whole industries by adjusting the tilt of his attention. Elliot spoke the name as if it might answer a prayer. Oslo is pragmatic, he said, pacing by the windows. They don't buy the glitter, they buy the math. This could be our expansion to 3 continents in one stroke. Naomi nodded, already sketching the model that would gird a deal of that size. Ring-fenced funds for equity-first pilots, governance that could not be bought off at dinner, deliverables that measured dignity as well as dollars. She drafted a briefing as lean as a winter branch, numbers paired to their living grain. The first meeting happened in their glass conference room. Lars arrived with a coat the color of slate and a handshake that felt like a signed treaty. His English was flawless, with a slight frost at the vowels. He did not waste words. Your outcomes, he said, eyes on Naomi's charts, are what we want. Your risk controls are ambitious. Ambitious keeps poor communities from paying for rich men's mistakes, Naomi replied, steady. Lars's gaze flicked toward Elliot, curious, almost amused, as if testing how the duo distributed emphasis. Elliot smiled, the trained smile of someone accustomed to smoothing a room. We balance bold vision with cautious execution, he said. It's why our clients stay. Lars walked the edges of the model with questions that felt like little hammers, tapping for hairline fractures. Naomi answered with calm precision. The conversation became a delicate bridge, math on one side, morality on the other, each plank placed by her hands. When the meeting ended, Lars shook her fist. Your methodology is the spine, he said, but markets are skittish animals. They must be coaxed, then teach them to trust something worth following, Naomi said. Lars's mouth made a small shape of approval. We will continue. After the door closed, Elliot exhaled as if he'd been underwater. You were, he began, and stopped, maybe searching for a word that did not bruise. Formidable. Formidable is what he came for, Naomi answered, gathering her notes. But that night, Elliot lay awake, eyes open to the dark, listening to the radiator tick. Formidable drew respect. Formidable could also alarm. Somewhere on a retreat years ago, a consultant had taught him the phrase, relationship risk. Elliot understood it too well, the way boardrooms flinched from being told the truth by the wrong mouth in the wrong register. He hated the knowledge. He knew its cost. He also knew how deals broke when nerves did. He turned and watched Naomi sleep, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, breath steady. She looked invulnerable like that. He loved her for it. He feared it, too. Oslo extended an invitation, a preliminary session in Norway, informal, exploratory. Elliot booked 2 tickets and then, quietly, changed the reservation to 1. She won't read the room, he told himself in the travel portal's sterile glow. Not this room. They need a soft landing. The lie tasted like cleanliness and convenience. He clicked confirm. He told Naomi the way a surgeon phrases a risk, quickly, with professional regret. It's just the warm-up, he said. You'll join for the strategy presentation when we've laid the groundwork. She held his gaze until he looked away. Groundwork, she repeated. Is that what we're calling erasure now? He reached for her hand. She didn't move hers. It's optics, he said softly. Just this once. Just this once is how people build bridges to places they shouldn't go. He kissed her knuckles, a gesture almost antique. Trust me. She did not say that trust, to her, was not a garment that fit anyone who asked to wear it. She did not ask the question that had arrived like an unwelcome guest. If he could not carry her into the room she helped build, what kind of home were they making? Instead, she nodded once, not consent so much as acknowledgement, and returned to her model. Work would not lie to her. Elliot landed in Oslo under a sky the color of pewter. The city was spare, clean, holding its beauty as if it were a private heirloom. In a boardroom of pale wood and viewable silence, Lars introduced Elliot to a cluster of advisors whose faces gave nothing away. There was coffee that tasted like a cold river, and a bowl of oranges so bright they looked improvised. "Where is Dr. Carter?" Lars asked, not unkindly. "Preparing the final framework," Elliot said, and felt the sentence stand between them like a glass wall. They talked for hours, about scale and contagion, about sovereign responsibility and the politics of patience. Elliot wore his charm like ceremonial armor, and to his credit, also wielded competence. He knew the models. He knew the beneficiaries' names. He knew the origin story they all loved. But when one advisor pressed on a subtlety in Naomi's wristbands, Elliot's answer missed the precise note by a breath. The advisor's pen paused. Only a fraction. Still, Elliot saw it. He felt the margin narrow. That evening, Lars invited him to a dinner where candles burned low and conversation moved like a disciplined river. Elliot described the Chicago pilots. A woman with a mathematician's calm asked, "And when your communities resist the timeline imposed by capital, who protects them?" Elliot reached for one of Naomi's phrases and found only an approximation. He accepted the nods that greeted his answer, knowing they were polite. He called Naomi from the hotel corridor, where the carpeting swallowed the sound of footsteps. "It went well," he said. "They're cautious." "They should be," she replied. "Send me the prompts they pressed on. I'll adjust the sensitivities." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt like the space under a door. "We make the second meeting together," Naomi said at last. Not a plea, but a principle stated for the record. "Of course," Elliot answered, and meant it, until he did not. The second meeting shifted to New York for convenience. Invitations went out. Naomi's name did not appear on the initial thread. Elliot caught the error and fixed it quickly, but the correction arrived with the faint aroma of an afterthought. On the day itself, a winter storm necklaced the East River with ice floes. Naomi wore charcoal and pearls that had belonged to her grandmother, the soft click of lineage at her throat. In the conference suite, Elliot began with a preface about operational clarity. Naomi saw the map, her role bracketed as brain, his as face. She spoke anyway, precise, unsparing, incandescent where the numbers required fire. Lars watched her with the attention of a sailor reading weather. "We will revert," he said at the end, which meant nothing and everything. Afterward, Elliot's gratitude came out backward. "You were strong," he said, as if strength were a flavor some palates disliked. "Say what you mean," Naomi replied. He did not. Perhaps he did not know the exact word. Perhaps he feared hearing it out loud. Unsettling, maybe. Unapologetic. The kinds of words men use when the truth threatened to eclipse their architecture. Weeks later, as the deal neared a hinge, small oddities accumulated. A dinner Naomi learned about from a calendar alert instead of from Elliot. A draft term sheet revised without her annotations. When she asked, Elliot offered reasons that felt like snow. Pretty, accumulating, muffling the shape of what lay beneath. "Some circles want calm, Naomi," he said finally, weary. "You bring a weather they don't understand." "I bring morning," she said. "If it scares them, they should stop living in the dark." He looked at her for a long time. "And if the light costs us the deal, then the deal can't afford us." He turned away, a man measuring the price of his own reflection. In the window, their building cast itself across the river, tall, certain, unbroken. Between the panes in their faces, the first fine cracks formed, too thin for either to admit, too sharp for either to ignore. Outside, winter kept its counsel, and far to the northeast, a city of quiet fjords waited to decide which future to finance, and which to unmake by simply choosing comfort over truth. Snow feathered down in the shape of quiet decisions as Chicago gathered beneath the Waldorf chandeliers. The ballroom glowed like a kept promise, gold leaf and crystal, a quartet coaxing silk from their strings, the kind of laughter that believes it deserves to last. Naomi arrived late on purpose, a small superstition she'd developed for evenings that frightened her. Emerald satin, grandmother's pearls, a mind arranged to withstand applause. The banner arched across the stage was an old prayer in new typography. Harrington and Carter, Annual Vision Gala. She had named it. She had written the vision. She entered to the sweet, polished smell of success and knew with her first breath that something in the air had shifted. Too much perfume over something spoiled. Elliot was near the stage, the room already orbiting him. The practiced smile, the easy shoulder touch, the gleam he wore when a camera turned its eye. Beside him stood a woman Naomi did not recognize, silver dress like a poured moon, hair the pale of a December morning, posture of someone to whom doors opened without hinges. The woman's hand rested on Elliot's sleeve with the intimacy of habit. Chicago, Elliot was saying into a microphone, has taught us to make courage practical. The crowd warmed to the sentence. Courage sounded agreeable when served on linen. He glanced left, and his gaze collided with Naomi's across the ballroom. It startled him. No, not startled. Disrupted. He recovered in a heartbeat, turning the moment into an introduction. Tonight, he said, we celebrate new leadership, fresh eyes on an old mission. Please welcome Clara Voss, our Director of Client Partnerships. Applause lifted and broke like surf. Naomi's chest tightened in that quiet, surgical way the body uses to keep a heart from leaping out and naming the wound. Director. Hired. Her inbox contained no such appointment. Her calendar held no interviews. Her skin felt suddenly too expensive for the body it kept. Marisol found her at the fringe of light, fingers cool around Naomi's wrist. Come with me, she murmured, the way one speaks to someone standing in a road where cars forget how to stop. In the anteroom, the quartet's music thinned to a far thread. Marisol's eyes were full. They made it clear. Anyone who told you would be out. I'm sorry. I tried. How long? Naomi asked. Her own voice sounded like a hallway bare of pictures. Months, Marisol said. Since New York. Since Oslo. A pause. There are photographs. Naomi did not ask to see them. Evidence would only teach her what her flesh already knew. Back in the ballroom, a ribbon of whispers wound around the tables. I heard she's stepping back. Thought leadership, they said. Clara's a natural fit, less intense. Intense. The word women receive when their competence has made someone else feel small. Naomi stepped forward because she had never learned how to step back. Elliot, she said when they were close enough to drown in each other's breath. I don't believe I've met your guest. Clara turned a face composed of courtesy. We've admired your work for years, she said, voice soft as non-committal weather. It's an honor to join the mission. Join, Naomi repeated, studying the cool circle of a ringless finger on Elliot's hand. A small, bright absence. Something in her stilled. It's been in motion for weeks, Elliot offered, too quickly. We're moving fast. Market timing. I meant to. To involve me? To tell me? To remember my name when you ordered a door with just enough space for one? Naomi asked, gentle as a blade. He breathed in. The room leaned. Optics, he said. The word arrived like a dropped glass. Lars materialized then, gray suit, fjord calm. Elliot, he called, as if summoning a well-trained dog. One moment. He turned to Naomi. Dr. Carter, a pleasure. His eyes took the inventory of a mind he respected, and a woman he would choose against if comfort were on the line. Your models are clarifying. Clarity doesn't flatter, Naomi said. Lars's mouth made the smallest of acknowledgments. He guided Elliot and Clara away with 2 fingertips and the authority of capital. Naomi stood alone in a ring of empty air. A waiter offered champagne and mercy in equal measure. She took the flute as an anchor and did not drink. The quartet lifted something tender. Around her, the city's most polished people performed astonishment and pity in alternating stanzas. Grace edged close, grief flocking her lashes. We can leave, she whispered. I'll call a car. Not yet, Naomi said. Tonight is an X-ray. I may as well learn the bones. On stage, Elliot spoke of streamlined operations and a new phase. The pronoun we extended and retracted like a tide that had forgotten the moon. He thanked partners, donors, the staff he could not succeed without. He did not say her name. The omission was almost elegant. By the bar, two men in tuxedos discussed her, in the tone reserved for sarcophagi and stocks. Brilliant, of course, one said, but never quite approachable. The other chuckled. Clara reads better. Naomi looked down at her hands, brown, steady, incapable of vanishing themselves into palatable translucence. She thought of every room where she had made the arithmetic love the people. She thought of the door that had closed behind her tonight without a sound. Marisol slipped a phone into Naomi's palm. A text glowed on the screen from an unlisted number. He told people you'd stepped back to think bigger. Another message. If you need an affidavit, I will write one. Naomi returned the phone. Keep your paper, she said softly. I will keep my name. The program's finale bloomed. Favors at each place setting, the quartet triumphant, a delicate rain of gold confetti like a blessing performed by a god who never asked what it cost. Elliot sought her gaze again, two beats of regret spiking through the lacquer. He moved toward her. Clara tilted her head and stayed where she was, already practiced at letting a room complete the story it prefers. Naomi's path to the exit felt ceremonial. She walked it with the composure of a queen abdicating a throne she had built, and now refused to share with courtiers who bowed to mirrors. Snow pressed its throat against the windows. In the foyer, the doorman remembered her from the first gala and from the nights when she had come late with proofs to approve, cheeks pink with honest cold. Dr. Carter, he said, holding the door like a vow. Outside, the city's breath fogged the night. Taxis stitched light into the falling white. Naomi stood for a moment on the edge of the curb and let the air unmake the scent of lilies and ambition. Her phone vibrated. A message from Elliot. We need to talk. Another. It's not what you think. The cruelty of that sentence, how it presumed ignorance as a kindness. She put the phone away. Somewhere, a siren unspooled. Somewhere, a street violinist drilled beauty through frost. Naomi stepped into the snow's deliberate hush and began to walk, the hem of her dress taking on the weight of weather. With each block, the ballroom receded, and a different music found her. The quiet of a decision that would never glamorous itself into apology. At a red light, she caught her reflection in a shop window. A woman in green with a crown of coils, jaw set like a compass. No fracture then, only a clean line the future could trace. She touched the pearls at her throat, a click like a code passed down. We endure, we outlast, we tell the truth. By the time she reached the river, ice was finding itself on the surface, drawing maps of what could bear weight. Naomi leaned against the railing and lifted her face to the snow. The night accepted her without asking her to shrink or soften. She thought of the office, of the plant reaching for light, of the code of ethics that belonged to her hands more than to any letterhead. She thought of the door she would close behind her and the door she would build next. Behind her, distant, applause rose once more. An end, a toast, a myth renewed. Ahead, the city opened like a palm. She turned toward it and went, her pulse finally keeping time with something that did not require permission to begin. The apartment received her like a stage after the audience had gone. Lights dimmed, flowers remembering applause. Chicago lay beneath the windows, its gridded constellations obedient and distant. Naomi set her clutch on the console and removed her grandmother's pearls one by one, as if unfastening a history that had done its work for the evening and now deserved rest. Elliot arrived with the cold on his coat and the ballroom still glowing on his face. He closed the door softly, almost reverently, as though gentleness could edit what had happened. Naomi, he said, voice sanded to diplomacy, we should talk. We will, she answered, and crossed to the kitchen where the marble held the day's pale light. She poured water, not for thirst, but for the steady occupation of her hands. He stayed by the doorway, the careful distance of a man measuring a minefield. It wasn't meant to unfold like that, he began. Clara's appointment. There were timing issues, onboarding. The optics were... Optics, she repeated, turning the word as if it might have a more nourishing side. The room understood your optics perfectly. He flinched, not visibly, but she could hear the wince inside his next breath. It's business, Naomi. not personal. Her laugh was almost kind. You erased me with a microphone and a spotlight, Elliot. You moved me from co-founder to furniture. What word would you like me to use for that? Decorating? He crossed the room in 2 steps, then stopped, palms open in a ritual of peace. You're brilliant. You know I've never denied that. But you bring a weather that rattles people. Clara makes the room comfortable. She reads as approachable. Approachable, Naomi said, tasting snow and ash, which is to say, uncomplicated to certain eyes, which is to say, white. Don't do that, he said quickly. Don't reduce me to. I'm not reducing you, she said softly. I'm widening the frame to include the parts you keep cropping out. Silence gathered, wallpapering the walls. Outside, a siren wrote its narrow poem through the night. He tried again, patient the way men are when they believe patience will be praised. We've been playing in bigger rooms, Naomi. Different cultures, different tolerances. They want soft landings. He searched for a word that wouldn't cut him as it left his mouth. Exact. Exact saves cities, she said. Exact keeps promises alive. He rubbed his temple with 2 fingers, the gesture of a man composing a clause. And sometimes exact costs deals. Do you want to be right, or do you want to build something that lasts? Her gaze did not move from his. The thing that lasts is the right thing. Anything else is a billboard over a sinkhole. He looked away then, past her shoulder to the river, to the version of the city that would never contradict him. You're exhausting, he said quietly, and the honesty of it surprised them both. Everything becomes a battle. I battle for the work, Naomi replied. You battle for the room. He exhaled, long and practiced. I've been protecting the firm. From me? She asked. From failure. He hesitated, then chose the cliff. I've been documenting our roles. For 6 months, the board needs clarity. If we split responsibilities, if you formalize an advisory position, we can stabilize, we can. She felt it then, the small click of a trap long set. Documenting, she repeated. Emails forwarded without my copy. Meetings scheduled on threads I never saw. Agendas where I become thought leadership, while you become senior decision maker. The calendar is a story, and you've been writing me out of it. The calendar is accountability, he said, brittle now. We can't be sentimental about governance. We can't be dishonest about it either. She reached for the leather folio she had left on the console after the gala, opened it, and slid out a thin stack of papers. Printouts, time-stamped revisions, track changes that bore her initials beside the architecture of their signature model. This is the spine, she said. The methodology that keeps the funding honest. You do not get to parade a new face beside it and pretend the body will breathe the same. He looked at the pages and then at her, as if suspecting a performance he had not rehearsed. No one is taking anything from you. You already did, she said, not unkindly. Tonight, you took the dignity of being named. You took my right to meet my replacement as a colleague instead of a surprise. You took the story we promised each other and traded it for a version the donors could swallow without chewing. Elliot's jaw tightened, revolt and remorse sparring behind his eyes. If we lose Oslo, we lose momentum. If we lose momentum, the staff goes. The pilots die. There are paychecks in this calculation, Naomi. And there are faces in mine, she answered. Women who waited an hour in the rain to talk to me after a town hall because the bus doesn't come at night. A city planner who kept a picture of her mother's street taped to her monitor. You don't swap out the face they trusted and call it a minor edit. He stepped back as if the room were too small for the truth they shared. What do you want me to say? Say the part you didn't want me to hear, she said. Say that my presence complicates rooms that were designed to prefer you. Say that comfort means my absence. Say that you wanted the money more than the mirror. His shoulders sagged. I want the future we sketched. I want expansion. I want ease. Ease is a poor architect, she said. It builds beautiful things that collapse at the first tremor. He moved to the bar and poured water he didn't drink. And what now? He asked. You want blood? You want me to fire Clara? I want honesty, Naomi said. Then I want space. Space, he echoed, as if tasting a foreign fruit. As in leave, she answered. and the word was a bell whose tone did not waver. Tonight, take clothes, take patience, take your arguments. Find a story that does not require me to shrink for it to look heroic. He stared, searching her face for the softness that had once saved him from the harsher versions of himself. She offered him courtesy and a clear road. He set the glass down. "You'll ruin us," he said, almost in wonder. "No," Naomi said. "You did that carefully, lovingly, with excellent diction and a budget line. I'm only turning on the lights." He went to the bedroom and packed with the mechanical grace of a frequent flyer. She stood by the window and watched the river think about freezing. When he returned, suitcase in hand, he paused as men pause before a calculus that finally shows its teeth. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. "Intent is a feather," she replied. "Impact is a stone." The door closed with the gentleness of a secret being kept. The apartment exhaled. Naomi gathered the papers from the counter, set them in order, and slid them back into the folio. Her hands were steady. Somewhere down on the street, a taxi idled, then moved on, carrying a man toward a version of himself he would someday try to disclaim. She turned off the lamps one by one until only the city lit the room. At the dining table, she opened her laptop and began. The document she titled Inventory did not list feelings. It listed facts, dates, deliverables, authorship, a ledger of how the work had been made and by whom. She drafted emails to counsel she respected, bullet-pointed the provisions they would require, and set aside the tender parts of her for a different hour. This was the hour for language that held in court and in memory. Near midnight, she paused and drank the water she had poured at dusk. It tasted like winter and resolve. On the windows, the city's light trembled but did not break. Naomi closed the laptop and held the quiet. She did not cry. She did not rehearse speeches for a future argument. She placed her palm flat on the table, the same wood where they had once mapped a life, and felt it steady her, as if the grain itself could recognize the hand that had built the house and bless the hand that would, in the morning, begin to leave it. Morning arrived without the mercy of surprise. Chicago glowed winter white, and the river carried a skin of ice the color of restraint. Naomi showered in silence, tied her hair back, and dressed in the sober armor of a charcoal suit. She ate half a pear at the counter and tasted nothing. This, she decided, was useful. Hunger sharpened the edge. She began with the ordinary holiness of paperwork. Bank portals first, joint to separate, automatic transfers paused, credit limits recalibrated so a life could not be spent on her name without her consent. She moved with an accountant's calm, each click a stitch closing a wound. The ledger of the last 7 years unfurled in tidy lines, dinners disguised as diligence, flights with subjects in their memo lines like alibis. She filed screenshots into a folder called Records and did not look at the photographs longer than the time it took to confirm their existence. At 9, she dialed a number she had kept for emergencies that required both precision and teeth. Ariella Knox, Esquire, answered on the second ring, voice low and bright as a blade. "Naomi," Ariella said, recognition softening into purpose. "Do I need to clear the morning?" "I need a clean exit and a lawful memory," Naomi replied. "I need my work to remain mine. And I need to be finished with apologies." "Come," Ariella said. "Bring everything." Her office was a high room of wood and light, where the city appeared in the windows as evidence rather than scenery. Ariella's suit was navy, her heels reasonable, her eyes patient in the way of someone accustomed to translating fury into filings. She listened without interruption, making notes in a tidy hand. When Naomi finished, Ariella asked only the questions that mattered. Dates, authorship, governance clauses, the IP assignment Naomi had insisted on when they incorporated, dismissed as overcautious then, a citadel now. "You were wise," Ariella said, tapping the clause with a manicured nail. "Your methodologies are yours. The firm licenses them. It does not own their spine. We'll notice them today. Preservation of records, temporary orders, immediate partition of accounts. You'll request exclusive use of the apartment pending dissolution, and I will require his counsel's agreement that all communications on firm channels be preserved and produced." "Will he fight?" Naomi asked. "He will posture," Ariella said, a small smile like a curtain being drawn back. Then he will calculate. We will remain unimpressed. Naomi signed the retainer and the stack that followed. Affidavits and exhibits, motions with titles that read like a liturgy. Knox versus fear, she thought, and almost smiled at her own private heresy. From Ariella's office, she went not home but to the firm. The corridors received her with the hush reserved for news still deciding whether to be whispered. Marisol stood the moment Naomi appeared in the doorway, eyes bright, relief spilling across her face as if a storm had bent and finally moved on. Grace closed a file with deliberate care and joined them. I'm notifying counsel to preserve everything, Naomi said. Emails, drafts, calendars. No one deletes so much as a comma. If you're pressured, send the request to me and to Ariella. Marisol nodded. We've kept our own backups, she said, something like pride in her tone. Not because we didn't trust you, because we trusted the day might come. In the conference room with the long table that had held so many futures, Naomi opened her laptop and began the inventory for real. Not just authorship, but provenance, where a model was first presented, who asked the key question that refined it, which pilot proved the parameter correct. She wrote names of community organizers beside formulas, initials of interns beside insights that survived into policy. She made the science admit the people whose fingers steadied it. This was not only legal memory, it was the ethic of the work made visible on paper. Midday, Elliot's email arrived. We can talk. We don't need lawyers. You're hurt. I understand. Let's be practical. Ariella's advice had already taught her the right silence. She filed the message under communications and returned to her list. At 2, she met with HR, an honest-eyed director who had joined because she believed in the firm's stated thing. Naomi was careful with her. Not an ally to recruit, not a witness to threaten, a professional to inform. There will be a transition, Naomi said. Please protect staff from panic. Payroll must be rock solid, and no narrative about me stepping back. If anyone uses that phrase, call me at once. I'll draft neutral language, the director said. Role delineation pending legal process. No speculation. Thank you, Naomi replied. She had not known until that moment how tired she was of gratitude used as currency. She used it anyway. This was not the hour for purism. Her phone buzzed with a London code. Eleanor Beaumont. Naomi stepped into a small office whose window framed a strip of river like a vow. I saw the photos, Eleanor said without preface, voice dry as a good martini. Then I saw the metrics out of Oslo move from green to amber. One presumes causality. Correlation, at least, Naomi said. I have a chair cold and waiting, Eleanor replied. Senior director. You'll have a budget and a lab of your own. Come to London. Rest your name where men cannot pronounce it without reverence. Naomi closed her eyes. The softness in Eleanor's offer was not sentiment, but shelter made by competence. I'm not ready to rest, she said, but I am ready to move. Then move here, Eleanor answered. Let this be a station, not an end. I'll send you a date, Naomi said. When she hung up, the window's bright strip looked less like a river than a runway. She returned home at dusk. The apartment had shifted into its temporary condition, spaces laid open by the absence of a man's ordinary scatter. On the dining table, beside a neat row of legal folders, she placed 3 piles. Keep, the pearls, the folios, the framed code of ethics they had signed with smudged ink. Give, a decanter he loved, 2 photographs where the past could stay kind, a wool coat that had learned his shoulders. Leave, the rest. She sent a locksmith's number to the doorman with an apology for the hour. She emailed the building's manager with the orders that would govern the week. Guest list, deliveries, permissions. Then she opened a fresh document and titled it, Departure. The lines unfurled practical and unromantic. Contact utilities, cancel Gala contracts she had signed. Transfer the plant at reception to Grace because it leaned toward her voice. At midnight, she wrote to the staff. Colleagues, the letter began, not team, not family, words she could not use without tasting the night before. There will be changes at the leadership level. Until further notice, please route all strategy-related approvals through me and Marisol. Our commitments to clients and communities remain intact. We do not insult the work by letting gossip manage it. She signed with both her names and sent it into the circuitry, where her voice would arrive without apology. Finally, she allowed herself the smallest ceremony. From the closet she pulled a suitcase, not the sleek carry-on for conferences, but the older case she had used when she left Atlanta for her doctorate, its corners scuffed by dreaming. Into it she placed a week of clothes, a slender book of poems, the receipted proof of her own survival, the articles of incorporation with the clause Ariella had tapped, her grandmother's Sunday fan, folded programs from the first pilots, each with a stapled map. She slept late for the first time in months. Morning rose clean. In the mirror, her face looked new in an unremarkable way. Not undone, not triumphant, simply accurate. She brewed coffee and drank it hot, and when the doorbell rang, she answered to a process server holding envelopes like liturgy. He checked her name, placed the papers in her hands, and departed with a nod. On the top document, in black letters that did not know how to tremble, the court recorded what the heart had already written. Petition for dissolution. Temporary orders. Notice to preserve. Beneath, Ariella's signature unfolded like certainty. Naomi sat at the table, palms on either side of the stack, and let the future settle its weight. There would be meetings and motions, a calendar dense with required graces. There would be headlines that misunderstood, friends who chose quiet, others who chose courage. She would let all of it happen at the speed of law. Meanwhile, she would do what she had always done. Make a plan and make it beautiful enough to live in. She opened a blank page and wrote London at the top. Under it, a list. Visas. Lease. A temporary flat with morning light. A route for running that crossed a park and a bridge. A kitchen drawer where a new set of keys could learn her name. Outside, the plane broke through a quilt of clouds and descended toward a city the color of pewter. Naomi watched the silver sprawl of London stretch beneath her, river coiling through stone, rooftops stitched in fog, a metropolis both ancient and perpetually reinventing itself. It looked, she thought, like a place that remembered every kind of exile. When she stepped out of Heathrow, the air felt softer than Chicago's, dense with mist and unfamiliar restraint. The driver held a small placard, Dr. Carter, and guided her to a waiting black cab. As they glided through Notting Hill, rows of pastel terraces blinked under the weak light. It wasn't home, but it was, blessedly, elsewhere. Her new flat sat on the third floor of a narrow Victorian building with crooked stairs and generous windows. The furniture was spare, practical. A wooden table, a bookshelf, and a kettle that hissed like an old friend eager to talk. From her window, she could see a bakery across the street, its door steaming with early morning warmth. Above it, a tree bowed under late winter drizzle, its branches fragile yet unyielding. Naomi unpacked quietly. She hung her coat, lined up her books, and set her grandmother's pearls on the dresser. Then she placed her work folio, marked and worn from months of battle, beside the window, where the pale daylight touched it. It was the first thing she'd truly owned since leaving Chicago. Her first day at the Camden Institute for Global Economics began beneath a sky that couldn't decide between rain and grace. The building was a restored Georgian townhouse in Mayfair, high ceilings, brass fixtures, and an air of subdued intellect. Her new colleagues greeted her with polite warmth, British in its economy. There was curiosity, admiration, and blessedly, no pity. Dr. Eleanor Beaumont, her mentor, met her at the top of the stairs. Dressed in a gray suit that whispered authority, Eleanor clasped Naomi's hands and said, "Welcome home to the work, my dear. London can be cold, but she rewards precision." Naomi smiled. "Precision is the only language I still speak." Eleanor's expression softened. "Then you'll be fluent here." She was installed as Senior Director of Strategy. Her office overlooked a quiet courtyard where ivy clung stubbornly to old stone. The walls were lined with policy texts and decades of forgotten experiments. Naomi ran her fingers along the spines and thought of her own, how it had not broken, only bent to new geography. Work came like a tide. Within days, she was neck-deep in a project modeling sustainable tax reform for emerging markets. Her mind, starved for structure, devoured it. She worked 12 hours straight, her pen racing across notepads until the ink trembled. When Eleanor found her still at her desk one night, coat on the chair, lamp burning low, she said gently, "You can't outwork grief, Naomi. It's a marathoner. It will keep your pace." Naomi looked up, eyes rimmed with sleepless clarity. "If I stop, it catches me." "Then stop and let it," Eleanor said. "You might find it smaller than you think." But Naomi didn't stop. Not yet. The days formed a rhythm both relentless and healing. Mornings began with tea and the rustle of the Financial Times. The commute was a short walk past flower stalls and cafes that smelled of butter and rain. At work, Naomi's models began to earn attention. Her team called her brilliant, and this time, it felt clean. Admiration without politics. By spring, the city started to thaw. She began walking in Regent's Park after dawn, the mist parting around her as though recognizing another ghost. She watched swans drift across the lake, unhurried, belonging to no one. For the first time in months, her chest loosened. On Sundays, she met Priya Mehta, a financial analyst who lived downstairs. Priya was small, sharp-eyed, endlessly talkative. They became companions in the way lonely women recognize each other without ceremony. They spent afternoons exploring Borough Market, tasting spices and talking about everything but men. And then there was Daniel Okoro, a journalist she met at an economic summit. He had an easy laugh and a gaze that didn't flinch from silence. They spoke about inequality, about migration and belonging, and eventually, about loss, the slow kind that doesn't announce itself. When he told her, "You don't have to turn everything into strategy," Naomi smiled faintly. "It's the only way I know to survive." He nodded. Maybe survival isn't the goal anymore. That night, she lay awake, his words pacing the room like light. By early summer, Naomi's reports had begun to ripple through the European policy circuit. Eleanor would forward articles with terse delight. "Brilliant!" caused an argument in Brussels. The praise no longer startled her. It felt earned, unsentimental, a currency she could spend without guilt. Yet even as her career rebuilt itself, something quieter began to shift. She no longer avoided mirrors. She no longer checked her phone for news from Chicago. When Elliot's name occasionally surfaced in trade publications, rumors of lost contracts, clients defecting, she felt nothing sharp, only distance, as if reading about a country she had once visited and barely survived. One evening, walking home through the drizzle, she stopped before a shop window and caught her reflection. Not the broken woman from the Waldorf, nor the strategist forged in rage, but someone else, tempered, steady, alive. She realized she had become what the city itself was, a blend of past ruins and ongoing creation. When she reached her flat, she found a package on her doorstep. Inside was a first edition of The Souls of Black Folk, a note tucked between the pages in Daniel's looping handwriting. For the woman who turned exile into architecture. Naomi traced the words, feeling their weight. She placed the book beside the window where London's light, soft, gray, enduring, spilled across the cover. Outside, rain slid down the glass like forgiveness learning its lines. Inside, Naomi Carter, at last, began to believe in the possibility of peace. Spring arrived in London like a confession whispered through rain. It began with small permissions. A window cracked open during a drizzle, a second cup of tea for the pleasure of steam, a walk with no destination but greenness. Naomi started rising before the city, tying her laces while the sky rehearsed its soft gray, and running through Regent's Park where dew lit each blade of grass as if the morning had a pulse. The swans became her silent tutors, unbothered, exact, moving through reflection as if to prove that grace could be learned. At the Institute, she changed the pace without announcing it. She blocked out an hour each afternoon labeled thinking and protected it with the devotion usually reserved for crises. She told younger analysts to leave at 6 and mean it. She replaced the fluorescent glare in her office with a lamp that made the room feel like an honest library. Her models still sparkled on the page, but they no longer asked her to bleed to illuminate them. On a Sunday that smelled faintly of wet lilacs, Daniel met her at Columbia Road Flower Market. Vendors called out the names of peonies like blessings. He bought an armful of tulips, the color of late peaches, and placed them in her hands as if giving a benediction. They wandered without hurry, jollying through puddles, stopping whenever a window offered something lovely for no reason. When the rain thickened, they found a cafe the size of patience and shared a slice of lemon cake that understood the value of restraint. "You still listen with your spine," he said, smiling over the rim of his cup, as if any sentence might be a cliff edge. "And you still ask questions as if you're interviewing my thoughts for citizenship," she returned, amused. Then, quieter, "I don't know how to trust ease." "Ease doesn't need your trust," he said, "only your presence." Presence became her discipline. She allowed herself the devotions that survive ambition, cutting fruits slowly, letting music fill rooms with no agenda, buying a wool coat because it loved her shoulders. She spent a Saturday at the Tate standing before Turner's Storms until the paint felt like a language she could live in. On Thursdays, she stopped at the bakery beneath her flat for a loaf still warm and thanked the baker by name. When a robin began visiting the plane tree outside her window, she watched it until it flew, without longing to cage anything that finally understood its air. Work carried her differently now. She led a round table in Brussels where ministers arrived wearing caution like stiff collars. Instead of dazzling them into agreement, she let questions do the labor. What would be true if the aim were dignity? Whom does the spreadsheet refuse to see? She spoke less, listened more, and discovered how power behaves when it's not being chased. The outcomes were cleaner. The room unexpectedly softened. Eleanor noticed first. After a meeting that ended in rare consensus, she closed Naomi's office door and studied her with a tenderness that did not need to be named. "You have stopped fighting the sea," she said. "You learned its tide." Naomi shrugged, eyes warm. "I grew tired of drowning." "Good," Eleanor said, settling in the chair like an elder settling a quilt. "Drowning is so boring for brilliant women." The letter from Chicago arrived that evening, a clipped notice about a contract Harrington and Carter had lost. She read it without heat. The anger that once marched through her rooms had lost its boots. She placed the letter in a folder labeled Past, which lived at the back of a drawer beside her passport and a map of London's cycle lanes. That night, she slept as if the dark had remembered how to carry her. Priya dragged her to a rooftop screening of a French film with subtitles that lagged behind the actor's size. Wrapped in blankets, they ate cherries from a paper bag and laughed at nothing important. "Your laugh has changed," Priya said, surprised. "It used to apologize. Now it doesn't even ask permission." "I'm rebuilding my citizenship in my own life," Naomi replied, and meant it. Daniel invited her to a reading in Brixton, where poems arrived like meteor showers, brief, incandescent, leaving useful craters. After, they walked through streets thick with music, Afrobeats folding into reggae, folding into a busker's trumpet. He told her about Lagos, about childhood Sundays glowing with stew and aunties and the sermon's rhythm that made even unbelievers sway. She told him about Atlanta and the old fans she kept from her grandmother, how church was less a place than a choreography. Sit, stand, sing, pass the plates, eat after. They did not reach for each other's hands. The air between them held a kind of poised kindness, a patience that felt like a taut string tuned to the exact note of becoming. The break came in the simplest of nights. She had cooked soup, leeks, potato, thyme, and texted Daniel half a joke about her newfound domestic bravado. He arrived with bread and a bottle, and the kind of attention that never mistakes silence for vacancy. After they ate, rain began to embroider the windows. She told him, haltingly, about the Gala in Chicago, the ringless hand, the word optics breaking like a glass between her teeth. She had recited the story before, armored and immaculate. This time it left her mouth imperfectly, with pauses that allowed the ache to name itself. When she finished, Daniel did not offer verdicts. He stood, rinsed the bowls, returned and said only, "You lived." The room, that plain sentence, lifted an invisible weight from the table. Naomi placed her forehead against his shoulder. It was not surrender, it was the opposite. After he left, she opened the window and let the rain reach her. For the first time since the Waldorf, she cried without argument. No closing statements, no footnotes, no defense. Tears did their ordinary, holy work. When they were finished, they left her not emptied but rinsed. She began keeping small Sabbaths, 1 hour a day when the phone lived in another room, 1 day a month where she was unavailable to the world and deeply available to herself. She wrote, not white papers but fragments, a description of light on the Thames at 7:12 a.m., the smell of old books and damp wool, a list of the words she had forgiven. Summer threw open London's careful windows. She and Priya rented bikes and crossed the city in a bright diagonal. Hyde Park to South Bank, past children unspooling kites, lovers arguing gently, a dog whose joy defied all economic modeling. In August, Daniel took her to Whitstable to watch the sea consider itself. They ate oysters that tasted like clean rain and read on a pebbled beach until afternoon became a blessing. When he finally threaded his fingers through hers, the gesture felt inevitable, the way sunrise is inevitable. A quiet accuracy, late and exactly on time. One evening, as swifts stitched the sky with their quick handwriting, Naomi stood at her window and realized something she had not been brave enough to admit. Exile had become habitat, and habitat had become home. Not the home of geography, though she loved the city now with its stubborn fog and its sudden blue, but the home of alignment. Her life fit. The zipper closed without snagging. She wrote a single sentence on a card and pinned it above her desk. Do not mistake speed for arrival. Then she turned off the lamp and let the room learn dusk. Across the street, someone played a piano badly and with feeling. On the sill, the tulips Daniel had brought were opening even in the dark, certain of morning, certain of themselves. It began the way structures give way when they have been lying to their own beams, not with spectacle, but with a cough in the ductwork, a light that flickered, a door that stuck in humid weather. In January, a routine client review returned not praise but questions, gentle, precise, the kind that meant the room had stopped being dazzled. In February, the Oslo dashboard shifted from amber to red. No alarms, no sirens, only the color of a traffic signal that had realized the car would not stop. In the glass tower, Elliot walked faster. He answered emails with the fluency of a man translating a text he no longer believed. He kept his suit jackets on the back of his chair like spare arguments. At meetings, he spoke of headwinds and liquidity lags and took notes in a crisp hand that betrayed nothing. On his desk, a photograph from the firm's early days remained. Naomi at a whiteboard, eyes lifted toward a point the lens could not find. The frame had not moved since she left. He told himself that leaving the photo there was a tribute. He did not admit it was a shrine. Clara, under the lights that had once loved other faces, grew thinner. Her laugh, perfected to read as ease, began to arrive late to conversations, a beat off the music. An analyst named Jonah discovered a citation on one of her signature slide decks that led nowhere. Another found a credential on her resume that dissolved under gentle inquiry. HR initiated a clarification. The word did not survive the week. Clara cried once in the ladies' room and composed herself into a decision. By March, she was on sabbatical, then pursuing new opportunities. Polite phrases for a departure that did not ask for applause. Clients have a sixth sense for rot. A southern utility that had been promised resilience noticed that the math did not fit the weather. A Midwestern city's procurement director, who still kept Naomi's first memo folded into her planner, requested a revision to the model and received rhetoric instead. She ended the contract with a letter that read like an elegy for competence. Elliot called her twice and left messages with the careful warmth of someone speaking to a widow. The board convened in a room that had forgotten how to be kind. PowerPoints arrived in navy and regret. The CFO, a careful man who had always admired the way Naomi made numbers remember the people inside them, spoke of cash flow as if reciting last rites. There is runway, he said, but it narrows. He asked for cuts. He recommended strategic divestments. Elliot nodded as if buoyed by a tide that could not possibly turn, and in the next hour laid off 15 staffers with sympathy that sounded like a language he had learned from an app. Reporters circled, not the loud ones at first, the quiet ones who call assistants and say please, the ones who ask for background, the ones who can feel a story through drywall. A line appeared in a trade publication. Sources indicate internal instability at the once lauded firm. The sentence was factual and bloodless, and yet it led to doors closing that had been held open by habit. He slept poorly now, when he slept at all. The bedroom clock blinked its red confession into the dark. He dreamed of corridors that tapered to points, of microphones that refused to turn on, of Naomi's back as she walked away into weather that respected her more than he had. He woke with his mouth full of copper and found the pillow damp, a detail he did not forgive himself for. When the auditors came, contracted by Oslo to confirm what instinct already knew, they wore expressions like sober daylight. They were polite to a fault, the way surgeons are when they deliver truth beneath anesthetic. They asked for the models that underwrote the most recent proposals, and the room offered them an architecture of approximations. Naomi's code, her loops and guardrails, existed in earlier versions. The updates were a collage of cuts and aspirations. One auditor slid a finger down a page and said only, "This parameter is aspiration, not protection." The sentence contained collapse. Elliot tried heroics. He made 2 calls to men who had been ushers at his family's weddings. He flew to New York in a storm and smiled at people who were not in the mood to be seen enjoying anything. He wrote a memo to staff titled, "Holding the Center," that contained words like resilience and mission and exactly one truth: we are not where we meant to be. It was not enough. Truth, when late, cannot buy back what its tardiness has cost. One afternoon, he found himself alone in the conference room with the code of ethics Naomi had insisted they print and frame. It hung crooked. He straightened it, as if alignment could be an apology, read the lines that had once seemed noble, now read like an indictment. We do not substitute optics for outcomes. He closed his eyes and saw the Waldorf's lights like a jury. Staff began to leave in 2s and 3s, not dramatically, but with the weary competence of people who know how to pack a life into a banker's box. Grace asked for a reference and received a letter elegant enough to make her eyes sting. Marisol submitted her resignation by email and then walked to Elliot's office with a plant that had attempted to thrive for years on reception's window ledge. "It likes real sun," she said, setting it on his desk. "We all do." "I'm not the villain you think I am," he said, surprised by his own voice. Marisol looked at him kindly, the way one looks at an old injury. "Some stories don't need villains," she answered. "Only choices." The Oslo deal, when it died, did so by email. Lars wrote in the tone of snow, "Cool, inevitable. We appreciate your efforts. The fit is no longer aligned with our risk profile." Elliot read the sentence twice and then a third time. He did not throw anything. He did not swear. He put the laptop to sleep and sat very still until the room returned to him. There were lawsuits, not noisily vindictive ones, but questions asked by municipalities about deliverables that had not delivered, by partners about disclosures that had been technically correct and essentially evasive. Counsel advised settlement. Elliot signed checks and felt nothing but arithmetic. He thought of the first check the firm had ever received, and the way Naomi had held it like a bird you free. Spring reached Chicago half-hearted, and then all at once. Trees along the river found their green. Tourists returned with unseemly optimism. Elliot walked to the office one morning through light that made promises it had not yet learned to keep, and saw, in the lobby's mirrored column, a man he recognized only the way one recognizes a cousin from a family branch you do not visit. The set to the mouth that meant calculation, the hollowness behind the eyes where conviction used to live. On his desk lay the final notice from the court, the formality that unclasped 2 names cleanly. He turned the paper over and signed where indicated, his hand steady, his chest switching briefly to a faster time signature and then correcting itself. He did not call Naomi. He did not write. He imagined her somewhere beneath a softer sky, her shoulder claimed by a coat that fit, her mouth lifted not by victory but by arrival. He imagined her building something in a room whose windows opened. By summer, the firm was a leaner, meeker thing with a new logo and a consultant's plan for becoming nimble. Elliot sat through a rebranding session where someone proposed the word renewal and tasted iron. At night, he returned to an apartment that had forgotten how to greet him and stood at the kitchen counter eating almonds with the gravity of penance. Loss did not thunder. It corroded. It left fingerprints he could not place on every surface. It turned the cheerful ping of his calendar into a reminder that time insists on doing its job, even when people fail at theirs. On a Tuesday that felt unremarkable as a receipt, Elliot opened the drawer where he kept the silver pen Naomi had given him the week they signed their first lease. He weighed it in his palm and understood, with a clarity that did not ask to be comforted, that he had mistaken comfort for competence, applause for proof, mirrors for windows. He set the pen down. Outside, the river did what rivers do, moved forward. Inside, a man learned what remains when the room stops clapping. Autumn arrived in London, not as a season, but as a temperament, an elegant fatigue, a sigh between chapters. Leaves curled in the gutters like sealed letters never posted, and the Thames wore the color of unspoken memory. Naomi walked through it all with her coat collar turned up, content in her anonymity. The world had quieted around her. The noise of ambition, of expectation, had receded like a storm moving offshore. One October afternoon, as the sun strained to remain visible behind a sheet of gray, Eleanor appeared in the doorway of Naomi's office with an expression that meant the universe was about to take an interest in her again. "There's a visitor for you," she said, voice careful but amused. "Norwegian, perfect hair, the sort of suit that suggests a moral conflict over its price." Naomi froze, her pen still against the page. "Lars Brenner." Eleanor inclined her head, the corners of her mouth lifting. "I see my description was adequate." Naomi stood slowly, smoothing the sleeve of her navy dress. "Tell him he can wait 5 minutes. Let him remember I don't belong to his calendar anymore." Eleanor chuckled, already halfway out the door. 5 minutes of remembering. Understood. When Naomi entered the small meeting room, Lars was standing by the window, studying the courtyard ivy with the same seriousness he once reserved for market fluctuations. He turned at the sound of her heels on the floor. "Dr. Carter," he said, voice dipped in that Nordic coolness she recalled. Precise, almost tender in its restraint. "London suits you. It's polite to its exiles," she replied. His smile barely registered, but his eyes flickered with something like admiration, or perhaps guilt. "I came to apologize," he said simply. "Which particular offense?" "For choosing comfort over clarity," he said. "For mistaking diplomacy for wisdom." She crossed her arms, not cold but composed. "And now?" "Now," he said, "I am reminded that integrity is a better investment than image. Oslo has a vacancy for leadership in a new global initiative. We are forming a consortium for sustainable redevelopment across Europe and Africa. We require a director, one with both intellect and conscience." She studied him. "And you came here to recruit me?" "Yes," he said, "because no one else can do it." The old reflex, skepticism sharpened by betrayal, rose in her throat. "Harrington and Carter collapsed under your watch, Lars. You called it market correction. You called it strategic withdrawal." "I know," he said quietly, "and I also know who built the thing worth collapsing." Silence stretched, weighted by unspoken histories. Through the window, ivy trembled under a gust. Naomi's pulse steadied itself on memory. "What are you offering?" she asked. He took a single envelope from his briefcase and placed it on the table between them. Inside was a proposal, clean lines, high numbers, and beneath it all something audacious. £70 million in seed funding for a new firm under her sole direction. Her name stood at the top of the page, Carter Global Strategies, founder and chief executive officer. Naomi stared at it for a long moment. "What changed your mind?" "Failure," Lars said. "Yours, mine, the kind that leaves the taste of humility in the mouth. I learned that good ideas die not from poverty, but from cowardice. You are not afraid to make people uncomfortable." She looked up at him, eyes level. "And what do you gain?" "A return on decency," he replied. Then, after a pause, "and the chance to tell myself I wasn't too late." Naomi closed the envelope, her fingers pressing along its edge as though testing its strength. "I'll consider it." "I thought you might," Lars said, gathering his coat. "There is one condition." Her brow lifted. "That you do not ask permission from anyone. Not from me, not from the press, not from ghosts." She almost smiled. "I've learned that language." That night, London hummed beneath her window like a city rehearsing eternity. Naomi sat at her small table with a cup of jasmine tea and read through the proposal again. The legal phrasing was pristine, the numbers deliberate. But it wasn't the scale that moved her. It was the possibility of authorship. Every page spelled her name correctly this time, and nowhere did it appear after anyone else's. Still, she hesitated. Building again meant believing again, and belief was an organ she'd nearly removed to save her own life. Her phone vibrated, a message from Daniel. The fog on the river looks like the world forgetting itself. You'd love it tonight. She set the phone down, unread after that line, and thought of how forgetting and beginning were often the same gesture performed at different speeds. When dawn came, she walked to the river, fog rolling low, the bridges pale and spectral. Standing there, she felt a calm she hadn't known in years. Not triumph, not certainty, but alignment. A quiet recognition that exile had done its work, and she was whole enough now to risk building something again. She returned home, made black coffee, and opened a fresh page in her journal. At the top, she wrote, "If I return, it will not be to reclaim what was lost, but to create what never existed." Then she dialed Eleanor. "Are you awake?" "Always, darling," came the dry reply. "Tell me you've decided." Naomi looked toward the horizon, where the sun was the faintest ember trying to belong to the sky. "Yes," she said, "I'm going back." "To him?" Eleanor asked carefully. "No," Naomi answered, her voice steady, almost luminous. "To myself." And with that, she folded the offer back into its envelope and sealed it, not as a transaction, but as a vow. Somewhere in Oslo, an investor would soon receive her acceptance, and somewhere in Chicago, under the same gray dawn, the man who once spoke for both of them would wake to find her silence transformed into empire. The tide turned, quiet and exact, and the world, slowly, surely, shifted its balance to make room for her again. Chicago met her plane with a sky the color of clean steel. Naomi stood at the curb outside O'Hare, the wind slipping its precise fingers under her coat, and felt something like ceremony lift inside her. She had come back not as a question but as an answer. The new office rose on the river's bend, a floor of sun and glass that made the water seem part of the room. She chose it for the windows, the way the city entered uninvited and was welcomed. On the first morning, she arrived before anyone else, set her hand flat on the conference table, and whispered the sentence that had survived every continent. "Do no harm to the people inside the numbers." They installed the name without flourish. Carter Global, in letters that caught light but did not show off. No ampersand, no second surname to require balance. Just the truth of one woman's authorship, finally unparenthesized. They came to her the way rain gathers, quietly, inevitably. Marisol first, with a ledger-bright gaze and a resignation letter that read like a poem about starting over. Grace next, bringing the plant from reception that had learned the sun, and a folder of models annotated in a neat, hopeful hand. Tomas wrote from Boston with a midnight code snippet and the subject line, "If you need a poet who also compiles." Priya sent a reference from London framed as a love letter to competence, and by the end of the week, a dozen desks hummed with people who had not forgotten why they began. On the first Friday, Naomi gathered them in the glass-walled room where the river kept perfect time. She did not give a speech. She read, instead, the code of ethics she and Elliot had once signed and could not keep together. Then she unfolded a new page, fewer sentences, deeper vows. "We will not confuse charity with justice. We will not trade clarity for access. We will name the harm and fund the repair. We will be kind in the way bridges are kind, by holding." They signed. Ink bloomed. The room felt provisioned. Work arrived before the paint fully dried. A coastal city, tired of seawalls that broke like promises, commissioned a climate adaptation plan. A Midwestern district asked for a procurement overhaul that favored local farms and lived wages. A sovereign fund in West Africa requested a 3-year blueprint that refused the old extraction masquerading as aid. Naomi took the first calls herself, her voice moving with a steadiness London had taught and Chicago had sharpened. Where other firms filed stakeholder interviews, Carter Global hosted listening tables, church basements and union halls and school gyms, with bad acoustics and good coffee. Places where dignity arrived uninvited and still took a seat. Naomi sat at each one, sleeves pushed to her elbows, asking the questions that loosened a city's throat. When did policy last feel like help? What would enough look like if we measured it in mornings? People answered. The models listened. By autumn, outcomes began to gather like migrating light. The coastal city's new zoning codes reduced flood claims by a third in the first storm. School cafeterias filled with food that knew the names of the fields it came from. The fund's first investments returned both profit and proof. Small factories reopened, apprenticeships sprouted. Nobody had to clap to believe it. The press called it a comeback. Naomi refused the word. She had not come back to an old room. She had built a new house and opened all its windows. Still, photographs followed. Naomi at a table with a school custodian and a deputy mayor, her hands describing an invisible spiral. Naomi on a site visit in boots, her laughter unarmored. Naomi alone at the office window at dusk, the river writing its endless sentence behind her. Eleanor visited once in October, bringing rain and dry humor. She stood in the doorway and eyed the wall of maps, the scatter of sticky notes that looked like constellations. "You have made something anatomically correct," she said. "A heart that knows where to send the blood." Naomi grinned. "And London?" "Missing you," Eleanor replied, but approving. They hugged like women who had taught each other how to stay. Daniel arrived 2 weeks later with a weekend bag and a question shaped like a smile. They walked the river in coats and silence, then ate stew in a corner booth where the waitress called Naomi love, as if she'd earned the word. Later, he fell asleep on her sofa with a book face down on his chest, and she watched him with that tender awe reserved for miracles that never asked to be believed in. Exile, she realized, had not taken love from her. It had made room for the accurate kind. Someone pinned a profile to the glass partition. The architect of better, how Naomi Carter redrew a city's ledger. Naomi read it once and recycled it. Praise was a fine visitor and a poor tenant. Across town, the old logo still clung to a lobby, letters slightly dull, as if they had learned too late that light is borrowed. Elliot passed it most mornings with a look that pretended not to recognize the shape of his own choosing. He heard the name Carter Global in rooms that used to wait for him, and learned, slowly, to let rooms belong to those who deserved them. In November, the firm held no gala. They held a harvest lunch in a public school gym whose varnished floor remembered 1,000 games. Farmers set crates of apples beside trays of roasted squash. The cafeteria manager cried when the local newspaper photographed her instead of a visiting dignitary. Naomi sat on a folding chair, eating cornbread that tasted like an auntie's certainty, and felt the tectonics inside her settle, plate to plate, truth over glamour, foundation over facade. After the tables were folded and the children's laughter rinsed from the air, she returned to the office and stood at the window while evening lacquered the river. The city's lights flickered on like a choir entering on cue. In the glass she saw two Naomis, the one who had been burned in public, and the one who had learned to be her own weather. Neither demanded apology from the other. Together, they made a woman singular and sufficient. Marisol tapped the doorframe and left a folder labeled Year 1, Metrics, Letters, Photographs, where the work had written its gratitude on faces. Naomi opened it and read until the numbers turned warm. She placed the folder on the shelf beside the souls of black folk and her grandmother's fan. The shelf looked like lineage, blood and thought, breath and ledger, women and their unfashionable insistence. Outside, a light snow began, each flake a small permission. Naomi turned off the office lamps and let the river's silver climb the walls. She did not speak. There are victories that prefer silence to trumpets, crowns that weigh nothing because the head has learned not to bow. She gathered her coat, slipped the key into her pocket, and walked into the night that knew her name, not as rumor, not as footnote, but as title. The Waldorf's chandeliers burned as if they remembered her. Their tiers of crystal held the city's winter light the way a throat holds a vow, bright and exact. Chicago arrived in velvet and ambition, a ballroom of polished certainty. Naomi stood in the anteroom for one measured breath, smoothing the sleeve of a black silk gown that didn't shout so much as insist. The doorman who had once watched her leave with snow in her hair and silence in her mouth nodded as though closing a circle. Inside, the annual Economic Excellence Gala arranged itself into constellations. Donors like minor planets, ministers in careful orbits, journalists browsing for gravity. On the central screen, Carter Global glowed without flourish. No ampersand, no explanation. The city said her name correctly, and the room did not cough. She moved through greetings that felt earned rather than owed. A superintendent pressed her hand and whispered, "The lunches changed attendance more than any slogan." A union leader offered her a paper carnation folded by apprentices in a welding class that now had a waiting list. From the stage, a moderator rehearsed syllables she had once watched people swallow. Eleanor arrived late, rain jeweled in her hair, and kissed Naomi's cheek with a matriarch's subtle benediction. "They will want you to be gracious," she murmured. "Be structural." "Always," Naomi said. When they called her name, Strategist of the Year, the applause rose not like a storm but like morning. Patient, unarguable. She crossed the room without hurry and stepped into the wash of light that had once unmade her. The podium felt less like a perch than like a desk she had earned the right to use. "My work," she began, "has been mistaken for anger when it is, in fact, measurement. Not of budgets alone, but of harm. We speak of efficiency, but there is nothing efficient about rebuilding the same neighborhood 4 times because we refuse to ask different questions." A hush gathered. The chandeliers held it steady. "I was told once that comfort closes deals," she continued. "Perhaps, but comfort also closes doors. To those who have been asked to leave themselves in the coat room so numbers may proceed unbothered. Tonight, take up your space. The math is strongest when it carries all our weight." She didn't name Elliot or the night he offered her erasure as a strategy. She named the cafeteria manager whose budget flexed enough to hire 2 mothers for the breakfast shift, the planner who changed a bus route by a quarter mile and raised a life expectancy map like a curtain. When she finished, the applause came again, softer this time, as if the room understood it had been seen and forgiven only to the extent it was willing to become new. After the photographs, after the handshakes phrased as lifelines, she stepped onto the terrace to let cold rinse the stage from her skin. November bit gently. The park below exhaled dark breath and leaf smell. Naomi rested her hands on the stone balustrade. The city's glitter laid out like a patient. "The door—" "Naomi," he said, and the name sounded as if he had practiced it alone. "You were magnificent." "That adjective is work for women to carry," she answered, still looking at the park. "Try accurate." "You were right," he said simply. "Which part? The one where I warned that exactness saves cities, or the one where I told you that comfort is a poor architect?" She tipped him the slightest smile. "Or the part where I asked you to say my name in rooms that wanted your echo?" He flinched, a small honesty in a body that had learned to perform elegance. "All of it," he said. "I am sorry." "I know," she replied. "You are sorry you lost what you built on a lie. That is not the same as being sorry for the lie." He swallowed. In the glass behind them, the ballroom doubled and blurred, a room that had learned how to see itself. "I have an offer," he said, tentative. "Not what you think. A merger, an alignment of capacities. Your models, my dash dash." "No," she said, with the kindness due a man speaking to an obsolete map. "The geography changed." He nodded, breath leaving him like a rehearsal ending without applause. "Could we, at least—" He gestured loosely, a man trying to conjure a noun that did not indict him. "Talk?" "We are talking," she said, "and I am telling you something you did not permit yourself to know. You were not weak, you were complicit. The room asked for my removal and you called it prudence. You signed on to a mathematics that required me missing." Wind worked its thin fingers through the trees. He pressed both hands flat to the rail as if anchoring himself to the present. "What can I do that means anything?" he asked. "Not to me," she answered. "I am finished being the place where men come to do penance. Do it in policy. Do it in payroll. Do it in who speaks and who gets paid to listen. If you want to be useful, become a door you used to guard." His laugh, brief and unadorned, steamed into the cold. "You always did give the homework no one wanted." She turned then, fully, to look at him. The handsome architecture remained. The authority had gone slack. She felt no victory, only a stillness that had nothing to do with him. "I forgave you," she said. He blinked. "When?" "When forgiveness stopped being a gift to you and became a release for me." She tucked a curl behind her ear. "It didn't make you safe. It made me free." He nodded once, a bow to a sovereign he no longer served. "I hope," he said, and couldn't finish the sentence without breaking its spine. "You hope I'm happy," she supplied, not unkind. "I am. And I am not auditioning for it anymore." The terrace door opened. Daniel stepped out, pauses handled with ease, the kind of man who knows how to arrive without replacing the air. He glanced at Elliot, then at Naomi. "You left your scarf," he said, offering soft wool like a thesis on consideration. "Thank you," she said, wrapping it around her shoulders, taking the warmth as the fact it was. Elliot took the cue a gentleman remembers even when the costume has frayed. He extended his hand. Naomi considered it and shook. Firmness, without ceremony. The skin-to-skin truth of it contained a decade, the bravery of beginnings, the cowardice of comfort, the cost of both. He released her with something like care, then turned and went inside, the light taking him back to a room where he would have to learn to sit among other people's names. Daniel watched her face. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, which is to say, honest. They stood together, looking out at the park until their breath matched the night. From beyond the glass, the MC's voice rose to introduce the final award. Laughter followed, then the bright clatter of cutlery resuming its ordinary work. Naomi laid her palm on the stone again and felt it receive her. Chicago, the first city that had tried to teach her to measure herself in mirrors. Chicago, now offering her windows. Inside, people were beginning to dance. Outside, the river kept its sentence, comma after patient comma. She thought of the girls who would read about tonight on phones under covers, of women who would forward her speech to one another like a psalm, of the men who might recognize themselves and choose to be better because grammar had finally met conscience. Naomi turned from the rail. "Shall we?" she asked. "Back in," Daniel said. "Forward," she corrected, and opened the door. The chandeliers, that extravagant old sky, received her without blinking. She crossed the threshold not as a returning heroine, but as a working woman with a morning to meet, a stack of proposals to edit, a city to keep honest, and a life steady enough to hold joy without spilling. The room made way. The night continued. And the crown, weightless now, sat where it had always belonged, not above her, but within. Morning came to the city in a hush of pearl, and Chicago offered up its river like a ribbon laid across a gift. In the corner office, high above the bend, Naomi stood with coffee warming her hands and watched the water keep its sentence. The room was quiet in the way rooms are after labor. Papers squared, lights low, a tulip on the table opening to no audience but air. On the bookshelf, a small parliament of objects held their quiet lineage, her grandmother's Sunday fan, a stone from Whitstable, sea-smoothed and sure, a first edition of The Souls of Black Folk, the framed page of Carter Global's Ethics, signed in ink that had learned to dry without apology. The day's agenda waited, a minister in Lagos at 9, a school board at noon, a site visit at dusk. But for a breath, she stood outside of time and took inventory of what remained. Not trophies, not headlines, the residue of usefulness. A bus route altered so a grandmother reached the clinic before her knees gave out. A flood map revised so a row of houses became homes again. Apprentices who smelled like metal and hope. Staff who left meetings taller than they entered. Marisol tapped the door with 2 knuckles, carrying a folder that had become a genre at Carter Global. Letters. Notes from cafeteria managers and planners, from girls who learned to square their shoulders in the mirror, from mayors who found a way to be brave without audience. "For when you forget," Marisol said, placing the folder on the desk, "you won't. But I like to be ready." Naomi smiled. "Being ready is our unofficial religion." "Then here's a hymn." Marisol hesitated. "And a reminder, the fellowship applications close tonight." The fellowship. Naomi's favorite act of insubordination against the future. The Carter Fellows, 12 first-generation scholars each year, paid not to hustle but to think, to travel, to spend time in rooms where their names would be said without shrinking. The portrait wall in the hallway had begun to look like a constellation. Faces from Atlanta and Accra, Detroit and Durban, Lagos and the South Side, each tethered by a thin gold line to the city they chose to love on purpose. Down the corridor, the common room hummed with the ordinary coordination of competence. Grace stood at the whiteboard drawing boxes and arrows like a cartographer of mercy. Tomas argued with a line of code as if it were a poem, refusing its last couplet. Someone's child colored quietly on the carpet. Someone else reheated soup that made the room smell like an auntie's kitchen. Titles mattered. Lives mattered more. At noon, Naomi walked to a neighborhood school whose brick had learned 1,000 winters without flinching. In the gym, folding tables were dressed with paper and pride. Farmers lined their crates like offerings. The principal, a woman who wore elegance and exhaustion with equal frankness, hugged Naomi as if greeting a sister. They ate cornbread and roasted squash while a ninth grader read a poem about a bus stop at dawn and the holiness of a thermos. An older woman, aproned, eyes bright, threaded through the crowd and clasped Naomi's hand. "I've lived by that river my whole life," she said. "Water used to scare me. Now it don't. Not the way it did." She squeezed, a benediction from someone with the authority of having stayed. "Whatever you're doing, baby, keep doing it." On the way back, a dusting of snow began to lace the air. Naomi and Daniel walked it together, shoulders briefly touching, silence carrying the speaking they didn't need. "Are you ready for tonight?" he asked. "The lecture?" she laughed. "Or the part where Eleanor pretends not to be sentimental?" He grinned and kissed her temple, a gesture with the grammar of home. By evening, the auditorium was full. Students with notebooks, officials with guarded faces, elders who had learned to expect performance and were suspicious of beauty. Eleanor introduced her with a sentence that felt like a door opening, then sat with her chin in her palm as Naomi crossed the stage. She did not rehearse triumph. She offered a ledger, what the work had cost, what it had paid, the units of measurement that mattered when nobody clapped. She spoke of failure as pedagogy, of models that looked perfect on paper and wrecked themselves against lived weather, of apologies made not as press releases, but as budgets that repaired what had been broken. She spoke of the day she realized legacy is not what is named after you, but what is no longer required of those who come next. "People ask me about power," she said, letting her voice rest in the room like a hand, "as if it is a thing you collect and display. I've learned to think of power as a bridge. It matters not because of its beauty, but because of what it carries and who crosses safely." She didn't mention the Waldorf. She didn't have to. The chandeliers were here, in the story's DNA, lesson mined, or extracted. She closed with the smallest of promises, that Carter Global would publish its methodologies open source within the year, that the fellowship would double, that the next director of strategy would come from the cohort currently sitting cross-legged in the first row, pretending not to glow. The applause came patient and present. After, a young woman waited at the edge of the stage, twisting the strap of her bag as if wringing water from cloth. "Dr. Carter," she said breathless, "I sent in my application. I don't know if I'm enough." "You are," Naomi said, not as encouragement but as measurement. "And even if you weren't, we would build the bridge between you and your own name." Later, in the emptied hall, Naomi stood alone amid the echo of chairs and promises. She felt not young and not old, simply accurate. The girl from Atlanta, the woman under the chandeliers, the strategist on the river, stacked within her like rings in the trunk of a tree. She placed her palm against the lectern the way a person touches the doorframe of a house they've made habitable, and whispered, "Thank you," to the work, to the weather, to whatever had taught her to refuse the shrinkage of other people's comfort. Outside, winter practiced its clarity. She and Daniel walked home, hand in hand, past shop windows where mannequins held their stillness like a profession. In the apartment, the bookshelf waited with its curated parliament. The kettle approved of boiling. Naomi opened the letters folder and read until the words grew warm. A boy from the South Side had written, "I used to think policy was a wall. You turned it into a hallway." Before sleep, she took out a slim manuscript, the book she had written in London, rewritten in Chicago, and finally allowed to end. The power of reclamation. On the last page, a sentence she had delayed for months now sat without flinching. Your worth is not a negotiation. It's a weather. Build where it holds. She turned off the lamp. Snow salted the night. Somewhere in the city, a bus arrived on time and a cafeteria opened its doors early, and a mother exhaled because the flood siren stayed silent. Legacy, she understood, was not marble. It was timing and route changes and revised line items, the choreography by which strangers discover they belong. In the morning, she would return to the bend in the river, to the office of Sun and Glass, to the staff who had chosen to believe professionally. She would write, sign, ask, answer. She would send another cohort into a world newly furnished with bridges. She would keep the crown where it had learned to live, unseen, unheavy, within. If Naomi's journey stayed with you, if you felt the shift from mirrors to windows, from comfort to clarity, add your voice to this community. Like to let the story travel farther. Comment with the moment that moved you or the bridge you're building. And follow to stay with us as we continue sharing stories of reclamation, courage, and the quiet architectures that change the world.